He whispered, "I'm leaving you for her," Masked he, but he didn't know I'd already seen his lawyer.
My husband whispered, "I'm leaving you for her," but he didn't know I'd already seen his lawyer. That sentence landed in the kitchen like a dropped plate. I remember the cool of the tile under my bare feet and the way the afternoon sun slanted across the counter, lighting up little things he never noticed. A grocery receipt folded in my apron, the chipped saucer I kept for myself, a note I'd left on the fridge about the neighbor's house key. If you like these stories, please subscribe to Soulbyte. It helps us share more. I was 59 when the whisper came. I had been married to Tom for 32 years. We lived in the same small house we'd bought before our daughter was born, the house where paint chips gathered in corners like quiet confessions. Our life had been ordinary in the way that makes up most lives. Breakfasts with newspaper margins folded over, cardigans draped over the back of chairs, the slow rhythm of grocery lists and bills, and the TV show we watched together every Friday. Tom worked at the plant until it closed. Then he took odd jobs. I managed the books at the church and did part-time work organizing files for a local clinic. We never talked about luxuries. We argued once about getting a new mattress. He said, "We'll be fine." I said, "I want to sleep well." The mattress stayed old because the dishes came first, the furnace came first, the car tires came first. That was how our small economy lived. Tiny sacrifices added up to stability. People in our town knew us as a steady couple. We were the kind who would bring casseroles during hard times and return library books late, apologetically. Our daughter, June, lived 3 towns over. She called every other Sunday. She knew my taste in coffee and my fondness for a particular channel on the radio. The neighbors knew I kept an extra loaf of bread, and Tom had a polite, quiet way of listening. No one would have guessed there was a fault line beneath that quiet, but fault lines are subtle. They start as a hairline crack and grow when you're not watching. There were signs over the years, small ones that I explained away. Extra hours at work, new cologne tucked into the back of a drawer, the times he would come home late and say it was traffic. He shut drawers a little harder than he used to. He started offering to help less with the dishes and more with the lawn. I told myself I was being silly, that aging makes people distant, that marriage can ebb and flow like the weather. The first sharp thing, the actual betrayal I felt like a cut, came on a Tuesday in late spring. Tom had been distant for weeks. He had stopped answering my texts. He'd taken his phone into the shed, which made him laugh as if he'd discovered a juvenile secret. I remember the sound of the screen closing in his palm like a small, quiet door. It was a small public thing that exposed him. We were at the grocery store, standing in line behind old Mrs. Hargrove, who always paid with a check. Tom's phone buzzed. He stepped aside, out of my earshot, and spoke in a voice too soft to be casual. "Yeah, I told her next month," he said. "Figure it out." There was something warm then, a tone meant for someone else, an ease I hadn't heard in him for a long time. I could have left. I could have marched out into the parking lot and demanded an explanation beneath the humming lights. Instead, I watched the butter melt in my cart and felt a sudden emptiness where his face used to be in my life. I paid for groceries as if nothing had happened. The cashier smiled. I smiled back with the practiced gentleness of someone used to smoothing corners. After that, there were small escalations. He started making plans without mentioning me. He paid for lunches with a credit card I didn't recognize on the statement. There was a receipt from a restaurant 3 towns away that had a name I didn't know, and when I asked casually, he said it must have been for a work meeting. The second incident was a humiliating whisper in the laundry room. I was folding towels when he came in, closed the door behind him, and said, "I can't keep lying. I'm going to leave you for her." He said it like a confession you get when the truth feels heavy and must be laid down somewhere. His voice was low, like he was sharing a secret with the laundry machine. I folded the towel slowly. My hands did the work they always did. I wanted to tell him to stop, to ask who her was, to throw the towel at him and shout something that would make him see me again. But I didn't. I felt an odd, clear calm settle over my chest. I thought of all the small things I'd accumulated over 3 decades. The address list tucked behind the recipe box, the faded invitation to a friend's wedding, the little dental appointments logged in my calendar. I thought, too, of the uneasy way he'd looked at his phone. That night, I opened the pantry and stood in the doorway watching the light on the jars. The kitchen table was the same table where we had balanced our daughter's homework and bills and 1,000 quiet conversations. I realized then I had a choice about how to respond. I could run screaming down the street. I could beg, or I could be measured and lawful and keep hold of the things that mattered to me. The realization shifted my feeling from frantic to strategic. I made a list. It was a practical thing, not a vengeful one. I wrote down accounts, the titles to the car, the place where I kept my social security paperwork, the certificate for the house. I made a pile of the receipts I thought mattered. The hospital bill from a year ago, the dental receipts, the little savings jar where I had been gathering coins for a summer trip to visit our granddaughter. There were nights when the pressure tightened like a corset. Tom became more careless, and the world around me narrowed to small, painful details. He stopped washing his shirts properly, leaving stains that told of evenings he had not spent at home. He left his coffee cup on the counter with lipstick on the rim. The privacy of our family was no longer private. It leaked out in odd places. A photograph missing from the frame on the mantel, a sweater that didn't belong to me draped over a chair. The social cost was palpable. At the church potluck, people who had always hugged me now gave me quick, unsure smiles. June called more often, but with the awkwardness of a child trying to balance both parents. She asked, "Are you okay?" And I heard her worry in every syllable. I told her I was fine because telling her everything would make her pick sides, and in my head I wanted to keep her out of the middle. One evening, I found a receipt in the glove compartment for a small hotel near the river. It was dated the same weekend as Tom's birthday 2 months before. The handwriting on the invoice looked like his, neat and small. My hands shook as I looked at it. I could feel the room closing in, the photographs on the wall suddenly heavy with history and accusation. I slid the receipt into my wallet and kept living my days as carefully as a woman carrying fragile glass. The pressure built in ways that were almost comic in their banality. Tom began to change passwords on accounts I had paid into together. The automatic bill for the satellite TV slipped to another name. He started claiming expense reports for car repairs he hadn't mentioned. These were small betrayals with big practical consequences. They were also proof that he was preparing for a life that did not include me. The third escalation was something that left me with a more concrete legal fear. I opened the mail and found a letter addressed to him from a law office. It was generic, the sort of form letter you get when someone is evaluating a claim. It had his name, printed neatly, and the return address of an attorney's office downtown. My stomach dropped. I thought of the hush of granite counters and the glossy brochures behind waiting room glass, and a cold logic clicked into place. Whatever was happening, he had begun moving in the world of paperwork and counsel. That was the turning sentence I needed. I understood then that this was not merely about feelings. It was administrative. It involved documents I had never thought to keep track of and decisions I had never expected to vote on alone. I had always assumed we were partners in the small economy of our life. Now that assumption felt like a misread map. At the midpoint, I found something I had not expected: power in preparation. I did not confront him. I did not shout. I called my friend Diane, who had a steady voice and had been through a painful divorce years before. Diane sat me down with tea and a stack of magazines, and she said plainly, "You should see someone for your head and for the practical stuff." That was all the permission I needed. I walked into a small attorney's office on a gray Thursday. The room smelled of paper and coffee. The receptionist smiled in that neutral way people in those jobs do. The attorney was a kind-eyed woman who introduced herself as Claire. I told her the truth in simple sentences. I didn't try to dramatize or to plead. I said, "I think my husband might be leaving me. I want to know what I should do." She listened. She wrote things down. Claire explained, in calm legal language, what documents I should gather and what my basic rights were. She said we would look at titles, at bank accounts, at any documents where a name might have been changed. She recommended we protect assets that were legally mine and make sure any joint accounts were accounted for. She said things like, "We'll need copies of deeds and statements, and keep a log of unusual withdrawals." She didn't promise vindication. She promised clarity. That clarity felt like armor. I started collecting things the way a gardener collects seeds for winter. I pulled out the original deed to the house from the file where it had sat for years. I photocopied bank statements and made notes on dates. I found a paper I had once signed when Tom had refinanced the car, and I tucked it into a folder labeled "Important." I printed February's phone bill and noticed charges I hadn't seen before. Most importantly, I documented the small things that are often invisible. The times he had called in sick to stay home with me when I'd had the flu, the checks I had written to cover repairs when our savings were low, the letters from friends that attested to my name on community accounts. I made an inventory of the china, of the quilts, of the wedding photos. It felt strange to list the things that make up a marriage as if they were inventory in a store, but that inventory became the truth that would keep me steady. I planned with the careful dignity of someone who recognizes that the world rewards calm preparation. I set appointments with the attorney, with our bank, with a financial advisor recommended by Diane. I told no one, not even June, more than the barest necessary detail. Secrecy, I realized, wasn't about hiding shame, it was about preserving options. If I told June and June told a friend, who told another friend, the gossip might reach Tom and a confrontation could ruin the advantage of being prepared. I moved slowly and deliberately. I transferred a small emergency fund into an account in my own name. I requested copies of certain deeds. I asked the bank about joint accounts and what would happen if one party decided to remove funds. They were helpful in the clinical way institutions can be. They explained procedures and waiting periods and paper forms. There was nothing dramatic about it. It was all forms and signatures and patience. Through it all, I remained composed in the house. I continued to make him coffee and set his plate out at breakfast. I folded his shirts and placed them in the drawer like a woman who knows her rights but does not want to escalate. He noticed my calm. He said once, half mocking, "You're being very serene these days." I smiled and said, "I'm tired." It was a small lie and a useful one. The public moment came on a bright morning in late summer when the leaves were just starting to think about turning. He called me into the living room and sat opposite me on the old couch. His hands were nervy. He never had been good at sitting still. He said softly, "I'm leaving. I've already spoken to someone." I remembered the laundry room whisper and the grocery line conversation. His voice was low, as if revealing a secret again, but this time his secret carried an air of triumph. He expected a crumpled heap of me, a dramatic scene where I would beg him to stay. Maybe he imagined me on my knees or calling the neighbors to shame him. He had rehearsed, perhaps, for the drama of being the one who announced the end. Instead, I had an envelope on the coffee table between us. It was labeled in my handwriting, "For Tom." Inside were copies of the documents I had gathered, the bank statements, the deed, the receipts. There was a letter to him that I read in a voice steady enough that even he could not interrupt. "I love you," I said, "but I will not be left without dignity." I told him plainly that I had seen a lawyer and that I had begun preparing for a life that did not rely on his presence. I told him I wanted an amicable arrangement. I offered him options to discuss, a timetable for dividing what needed to be divided. I did not shout. I did not cry in a way that would pressure him. I simply set boundaries and explained them. He sat back and for the first time in weeks looked surprised. Not with shame, that would have been satisfying in a petty way. He was surprised because I had taken control of the narrative. He leaned forward, asking small questions about the bank statements, about the title. He had expected me to be unsteady, and instead I was prepared. There was no dramatic courtroom fever that afternoon. There was an exchange of papers and the quiet hum of the refrigerator in the background. We agreed to meet again with our attorney to discuss a fair division. He said he was sorry, and it was a small, flat sorry that didn't reach very far. I accepted it in the same way I accepted the weather, an observation, not an absolution. The aftermath was not cinematic. It was a set of ordinary days where the extraordinary had been acknowledged and steps were taken to make living possible again. We sorted through drawers and boxes and made lists of what would go where. Sometimes we sat at the kitchen table making a plan for the landline and the little things that nobody imagines they'll need to plan for when they are young and cert. My dignity was not a headline or a revenge. It was a series of small acts. Keeping the house keys in my pocket, making sure my name was on certain accounts, asking for copies of statements at the bank. I refused to let anger erase the memory of the good we'd had. There were still mornings when I would look at the photo on the mantel and remember the wedding dress my mother had sewn, the way we danced badly in the living room, the birth of our daughter with the bright, frantic midwife. Those memories I kept as sacred, not as bargaining chips. People asked how I stayed so calm. My answer was practical. I had prepared. Preparation gives you room to breathe. It gives you the power to reply rather than react. In my quiet, I did not write him off as a villain. I simply acknowledged that his path and mine were no longer the same. The moral resolved itself slowly. I learned that betrayal could be met with grace and with firmness at the same time. I learned that dignity was about keeping one's own counsel and one's own papers in order. I learned that real courage, the kind that lasts past a headline, is little more than patience applied with intention. A month later, at a community potluck, I sat with women who had watched me pick at my casserole with a polite smile. They now asked about the house and about plans for winter. They were gentle in their curiosity. I answered straightforwardly. I felt the relief that comes from being honest without spectacle. I did not seek revenge. I did not shout his infidelities from the rooftops. Instead, I focused on the things that mattered: a steady roof, a checkbook that balanced, a relationship with my daughter that was not narrowed by drama. I visited with June more often. We started baking together on weekends. I helped her with the grandchild's preschool applications, and I found that ordinary tasks gave me more comfort than any dramatic vindication could have. I also forgave myself for not seeing it sooner. I had been complicit in a gentleness that sometimes blurred my edges. I had accepted a life that was quietly diminishing because I valued stability. That recognition was not a self-attack. It was a lesson. I kept my lesson like a stone in my pocket, weighty, honest, useful for steadying me when I needed it. In the end, he left with a small truck and a box of things. We signed papers that set a fair division. There were no fireworks, and there was no dramatic vindication. But there was a long, plain letter from me that I left in the glove compartment of his car, a letter that thanked him for 32 years and asked for nothing more than mutual respect as we walked away. If you asked me what the point of my story was, I would say this: dignity is practical. It is meals on the table, papers in order, and the courage to be quiet when others expect noise. This was not a movie. It was a real-life story about a woman who chose clarity over spectacle and who kept her sense of self when the world asked her to give it up. If you've been through something similar, know that small, steady steps matter. Gather your receipts. Make a list. Call a trusted friend. If you need legal advice, talk to a professional, not because you want to fight, but because you want to understand your options. Thank you for listening to my emotional story. If you found something here that helps, please like, comment, and subscribe to Soulbyte. Your quiet support means more than you know.